Before we begin this story, remember, every empire hides a secret, and every secret demands to be uncovered. What you're about to hear isn't just about crime. It's about power, fear, and how far people will go to control both. If you love true stories of corruption, betrayal, and survival in the shadows, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join our community. Every week, we reveal the untold side of history, stories the world tried to bury. Stay until the end, because this one will change how you see everything. In the cold silence of Soviet labor camps, far from the public eye, a code was born. A code that would later infect the streets of America with an underworld so disciplined, so brutal, and so invisible that even the FBI would take decades to understand its roots. The prisoners who lived by this code called themselves Vory v Zakone, the thieves in law. They were not simple criminals. They were philosophers of crime, men who rejected the Soviet state entirely and built their own moral universe behind bars. Within that secret world, the rules were absolute. Loyalty above all, silence above freedom, and betrayal punishable by death. When the Soviet Union began to loosen its grip in the 1970s, thousands of Jews, political dissidents, and refugees were allowed to emigrate to the West. Among them hid the Vory. They were ghosts in plain sight, men hardened by years of prison and violence, who saw opportunity not in the American dream, but in its weaknesses, greed, corruption, and the illusion of law and order. The United States welcomed the refugees from oppression with open arms, never realizing that some of them carried within them the seeds of a new criminal empire. Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, became their kingdom. To the public, it was a neighborhood of Soviet immigrants trying to start over, families speaking Russian, small grocery stores with Cyrillic signs, children playing near the boardwalk. But behind the closed doors of dimly lit cafes and smoky basements, deals were made in whispers. The old code from the gulags found new life in America. What began as a network of small-time hustlers selling stolen caviar or forged visas evolved into a complex criminal structure that rivaled the Italian Mafia in both wealth and influence. The early 1980s were a time of confusion and transition. The Cold War still defined politics, and the FBI's attention was consumed by fears of Soviet espionage. No one thought to look inside the immigrant communities that grew in places like Brighton Beach, Chicago, and Los Angeles. It was the perfect cover. The Russian Mafia, though it never called itself that, thrived under invisibility. Its leaders operated like ghosts, their names unknown, their meetings disguised as family dinners or cultural gatherings. Money laundering through small import-export businesses became their specialty. They dealt in everything that moved profitably across borders: diamonds, art, arms, drugs, and human beings. But to understand their methods, one must return to the gulags, where these men were molded. Inside those frozen prisons, life depended on hierarchy and honor. The Vory v Zakone ruled through a strict structure of rituals and punishment. Tattoos became their language. Every symbol on their skin told a story. How many years they'd served, how many betrayals they'd survived, and which sins they had committed or avoided. To break the code was to die, and this culture of absolute loyalty followed them across the ocean. In America, that same system was reimagined to control not prisoners, but businessmen, lawyers, and corrupt officials. The first generation of Russian criminals in New York understood that brute force alone would not build an empire. They needed legitimacy, or at least the illusion of it. So they opened restaurants, nightclubs, shipping companies. They learned English, they dressed in suits, and they pretended to be respectable. Yet, beneath that surface, money flowed like blood. Millions were moved through shell corporations. Bribes were paid to union leaders and dock officials. Cocaine from South America was exchanged for stolen Soviet technology. Brighton Beach became more than a neighborhood. It was a global hub of illicit trade, connected to Moscow, Tel Aviv, and Berlin. The local police were confused. To them, Russian immigrants were quiet, industrious, and law-abiding. The crimes, when they happened, were so meticulously planned that no one knew where to start. Witnesses never spoke. Victims often disappeared. Informants were few, not because they were loyal, but because they were terrified. The Vory ruled with psychological precision. Violence was reserved for those who truly deserved it under their code, and when it came, it was swift and final. In one particularly chilling story from early 1981, a restaurant owner in Brighton Beach refused to pay protection money. A week later, his establishment burned down in the middle of the night. No one saw who did it. No one talked. When his son asked for police help, the officer simply said, "Son, in your neighborhood, some problems solve themselves." That silence was the mafia's greatest weapon. Not fear alone, but acceptance. By the mid-1980s, the Russian criminal world in America had organized itself around a handful of powerful figures, men who traced their lineage directly to the Soviet underworld. They met regularly in private rooms, discussing shipments, bribes, and assassinations over vodka and black bread. Their conversations often mixed Russian, English, and criminal slang, but one word was always clear: Zakon, the law. Their law. Theirs was not chaos. It was order, an invisible government functioning within a democracy that didn't know it existed. Meanwhile, the FBI began hearing whispers about something called the Red Mafia. They didn't believe it at first. Organized crime in America was supposed to wear Italian suits and speak with Sicilian accents. Russians were supposed to be spies, not mobsters. But as reports of tax fraud, gun smuggling, and assassination attempts grew, agents realized they were facing a new kind of enemy, one with no clear hierarchy, no central boss, and no predictable behavior. In Brighton Beach, the Vory built an empire without ever announcing it. They used culture as camouflage. They sponsored community events, helped fellow immigrants find housing, donated to churches. To outsiders, they were patriots rebuilding their lives. To insiders, they were the architects of a new criminal order. They had learned from the Italians, but surpassed them in patience. Where the mafia ruled neighborhoods, the Russians ruled systems: banking, trade, immigration, and even law enforcement. Their crimes were not just bloody, they were brilliant. Every empire has its genesis myth, and for the Russian Mafia, it began in those frozen labor camps of Stalin's era, where suffering became strength and silence became power. The men who once defied the Soviet regime had simply found a new battlefield, America. And on that battlefield, they would rise without a single declaration of war, building a network so secret, so disciplined, and so ruthless that it would change organized crime forever. Brighton Beach still carries that shadow today. Beneath the sound of waves and the laughter of children, the ghosts of the 1980s linger. The cafes still whisper in Russian. The old men who sit by the boardwalk remember the faces of those who never returned. And if you listen closely, under the music and the chatter, you can almost hear it, the echo of the Gulag Code alive in the heart of Brooklyn. By the dawn of the 1980s, the Russian Mafia in America had moved beyond the shadows of Brighton Beach. What began as small-time hustling among immigrants was quickly evolving into a sophisticated underground empire that thrived on manipulation, intimidation, and a near-perfect understanding of how to exploit the cracks in the American system. These men had studied capitalism not through textbooks, but through its vulnerabilities. They saw greed where others saw opportunity, weakness where others saw trust. And in that realization, they built one of the most complex criminal networks the United States had ever seen. Their empire was not measured in blood alone, but in money. Clean, fast, and untraceable. Money became their weapon. The Russians understood that true power in America didn't come from violence, it came from invisibility. Through legitimate-looking import-export companies, car dealerships and gas stations, they laundered millions of dollars every month. Everything from stolen art to counterfeit electronics passed through their hands. And because they were fluent in both Russian and the language of American capitalism, they were almost impossible to detect. Brighton Beach, Miami, and Los Angeles became nodes in a growing transnational web. The Mafia's financial operations extended into Europe, Israel, and even back into the crumbling Soviet Union. Corrupt customs officials in Moscow sold export permits for cash. Mobsters in Brooklyn used them to import fake goods. By the time authorities discovered the fraud, the money had already been washed through offshore accounts in Cyprus and Panama. In the process, the Russians began to master what modern investigators now call layering, the art of burying illegal profits beneath endless legal transactions until no one could tell what was real. Their violence, when it surfaced, was precise and surgical. There were no drive-by shootings, no loud gun battles on the street. Instead, there were quiet disappearances, carefully staged accidents, and the occasional body found floating near the Hudson River. A man might owe money one week and vanish the next, leaving behind nothing but whispers. The message was always the same: the Brotherhood remembers, the Brotherhood never forgives. At the center of this new empire were figures who had learned to combine brute intelligence with the cold logic of profit. They treated crime like business, with balance sheets, ledgers, and risk assessments. They didn't just steal, they invested. They bought warehouses, restaurants, shipping companies, and luxury condos. They used American lawyers and accountants, some unwitting, others fully complicit. And through these networks, they began to infiltrate legitimate industries. Construction, waste management, energy, and finance all became contaminated with their silent touch. One of their most audacious ventures involved fuel. Gasoline distribution, particularly in New York and New Jersey, was a goldmine for anyone who understood tax loopholes. The Russians learned from the Italian Mafia how to manipulate the system, but refined it with ruthless precision. They created phantom companies that bought and sold fuel on paper, each transaction adding a layer of deception. Millions in unpaid taxes vanished into private accounts. The operation was so effective that the U.S. Treasury would later describe it as a billion-dollar theft hidden in plain sight. Weapons also became central to their business. While the Italian Mafia dealt in narcotics, the Russians had access to something far more dangerous: the decaying Soviet military stockpiles. From the early 1980s onward, black market arms began to flow westward. Kalashnikov rifles, explosives, and even surface-to-air missiles were trafficked through Eastern Europe, disguised as industrial equipment, and sold to buyers across Latin America and the Middle East. The money from these deals was funneled back to New York and Miami, strengthening the Mafia's control over both continents. The FBI at that time was unprepared for this kind of criminal sophistication. They were experts at chasing mobsters who killed over territory, not financiers who built invisible empires. The Russians had no single boss like Gotti or Capone. They operated more like an intelligence agency, compartmentalized, disciplined, and loyal only to the code. Each cell knew little about the others. Orders flowed through encrypted channels, often disguised as business correspondence or coded faxes. When one part of the network was compromised, the rest adapted instantly. The violence that did reach the public eye often seemed random, but it wasn't. Every murder served a purpose. A businessman who refused to cooperate might die in what looked like a robbery. A witness scheduled to testify might be struck by a drunk driver the night before court. It was this illusion of randomness that terrified communities the most. People whispered that the Russians could reach anyone, anywhere, and that no one was beyond their grasp. By the mid-1980s, their influence extended into politics and law enforcement. Corruption became another form of investment. A few $1,000s could buy silence. A few favors could open doors to government contracts. They knew how to flatter and how to intimidate. FBI informants reported that some New York detectives were warned not to interfere with the Russians because they had friends in high places. Whether that was true or not didn't matter. The fear alone was enough. What made this empire even more terrifying was its adaptability. While other crime families were trapped in traditional rackets, the Russians were innovators. They embraced technology early, using computers for financial fraud long before the internet age. They understood that the future of crime was not on the street, but in the systems that governed money itself. Every bank account, every offshore company, every loophole became a potential battlefield. Their expansion was not limited to the East Coast. In Chicago, Russian gangs formed alliances with local syndicates. In Los Angeles, they infiltrated the entertainment industry, using film studios as fronts for money laundering. Miami became a paradise for their financial operations, where cash from arms deals and art thefts could be turned into beachfront property overnight. They didn't need guns to conquer cities. They used contracts, shell companies, and fear. And yet, despite their sophistication, the Russians never forgot where they came from. Their meetings still opened with vodka toasts to fallen comrades. Their tattoos still told stories of the Gulag. Their loyalty still belonged to the old code, to the Vory v Zakony. The world around them had changed, but their values remained frozen in time: loyalty, silence, and brotherhood. By the end of the decade, the Russian Mafia had become one of the most powerful criminal forces in America, unseen, unacknowledged, but omnipresent. They had turned capitalism into a weapon, democracy into a disguise, and fear into an art form. And while the FBI began to circle closer, the Russians were already thinking ahead, preparing for a new kind of war. One fought not with guns or drugs, but with numbers, technology, and influence. The 1980s were only the beginning. The true empire had just begun to show its face, and behind that face was the chilling intelligence of men who had survived the Soviet hell and now ruled the American dream from the shadows. In the labyrinth of the 1980s underworld, one man emerged from the shadows of Brighton Beach to become the face and the brain of the Russian Mafia's new financial era. His name was Marat Balagula, and to those who knew him, he wasn't just a gangster. He was a strategist, a visionary of crime, a man who could turn complex systems into tools for domination. While others ruled the streets through fear, Balagula ruled them through intellect. He understood that true power didn't come from pulling the trigger. It came from knowing which laws could be broken without anyone realizing it. Born in the Soviet Union, Balagula had grown up under a regime where survival was an art form. The black market was the only real market, and he mastered it early. By the time he arrived in the United States during the late 1970s, he already possessed a gift that most criminals never developed: the ability to read economies like maps. He saw patterns where others saw chaos, opportunities where others saw risk. In America, that instinct became his weapon. Brighton Beach, by then, was buzzing with activity. Immigrants opening stores, hustlers selling fake goods, and small-time criminals carving out territories. But Balagula had no interest in petty theft or local rackets. He wanted something bigger, something that could generate millions without firing a single shot. His answer came from a loophole in the American tax system, buried deep within the gasoline trade. It was called the fuel tax scam, and under Balagula's mind, it would become the foundation of one of the largest criminal operations in U.S. history. Here's how it worked. Every time gasoline was sold in America, a federal and state tax was supposed to be collected and passed along to the government. But between the refineries, distributors, and gas stations, there were multiple middlemen, layers of companies responsible for collecting and remitting those taxes. Balagula realized that if you created a company that sold fuel, collected the taxes, and then vanished before paying the government, you could pocket the difference. The trick was to keep creating new shell companies, each one disappearing just as another was born. The system wasn't illegal until someone got caught, and Marat never planned to get caught. At first, it was small, a few companies, a few $1 million. But soon the operation exploded. By the mid-1980s, the so-called gasoline bootlegging empire was generating hundreds of millions in profits. The Russians controlled distribution chains across New York and New Jersey, selling legitimate fuel while siphoning off tax money that should have gone to the government. Trucks rolled day and night, invoices were forged, and accountants were paid to look the other way. No one understood how deep the scheme ran, not even the oil companies themselves. Balagula's genius was that he treated the entire operation like a corporation. He employed economists, lawyers, and even former IRS agents. Everyone had a role, and everyone was replaceable. He didn't rely on street soldiers with guns, but on men in suits who understood balance sheets and banking codes. This professionalism made him untouchable for a while. When the FBI first started hearing whispers about the scam, they didn't even know who to chase. The companies involved had legitimate paperwork, paid employees, and filed taxes, just not all of them. By the time the Bureau traced one company's records, it had already been dissolved and replaced by another. Agents described it as trying to catch smoke with bare hands. But the money didn't just stay in the US. Balagula used his global connections to move his fortune overseas. Millions were wired to Switzerland, Cyprus, and Israel. Some of it funded new ventures in Europe, others financed bribes and political favors. He began to live like royalty, hosting lavish parties in Brighton Beach restaurants, always surrounded by bodyguards and businessmen who owed him everything. Unlike most mob bosses, Balagula preferred intellect over intimidation. He read philosophy, quoted Tolstoy, and discussed politics as comfortably as he discussed money laundering. Even the Italian Mafia, who once looked down on the Russians, came to respect him. John Gotti, the infamous Gambino crime boss, reportedly referred to Balagula as the Russian with the brain. The two even met through intermediaries to coordinate fuel deals. The Russians supplied the logistics, the Italians provided protection, and together they reaped fortunes. But power attracts attention, and attention is the enemy of invisibility. By 1986, federal agents had begun connecting the dots. They discovered dozens of shell companies tied to the same addresses, the same bank accounts, and the same names, all pointing toward Brighton Beach. One by one, Balagula's associates were arrested, but he remained untouchable, hidden behind layers of proxies. The media began calling him the godfather of the gasoline empire. To his followers, he was a legend. To law enforcement, he was a ghost. His downfall came not from greed, but from trust, or rather, misplaced loyalty. One of his closest associates, fearing prison time, agreed to cooperate with authorities. The information led to Balagula's indictment on charges of fraud and racketeering. By the late 1980s, his empire began to crumble, yet even behind bars, his influence persisted. Other Russian bosses learned from his methods, adopting his techniques for laundering money, avoiding detection, and turning bureaucracy into a weapon. Balagula's story became more than just a tale of criminal brilliance. It was a blueprint for the modern Russian Mafia. He had proven that violence could be replaced by intellect, and that the real battlefield was not the street, but the financial system. His strategies would later evolve into the sophisticated global fraud networks that dominate organized crime today, from cybercrime rings to offshore laundering schemes. When journalists later interviewed former Russian mobsters, they all said the same thing. Marat changed everything. Before him, the mafia was about intimidation. After him, it was about strategy. His empire might have fallen, but his ideas survived. spreading across continents, influencing generations of criminals who realized that power in the modern world is built not with bullets, but with bank accounts. In the end, Marat Balagula's legacy was both brilliant and tragic. He had outsmarted governments, rival gangs, and even the mafia itself, but he couldn't escape the inevitable truth that all empires, even underground ones, eventually collapse. His rise marked a turning point in history, the moment when organized crime became fully globalized, driven not by passion or loyalty, but by calculation and control. And while the streets of Brighton Beach eventually quieted, the echoes of his empire still lingered in the banks, in the businesses, in the hidden flows of money that shaped entire cities. Because Marat had taught the world one timeless lesson: in a nation built on capitalism, the most dangerous criminal isn't the one with a gun, it's the one who understands the system better than anyone else. By the mid-1980s, the Russian Mafia's power in America had grown too large, too rich, and too organized to remain invisible. What had begun in the shadows of Brighton Beach now stretched across New York, New Jersey, and Florida. Money flowed endlessly through shell companies, corrupt unions, and offshore accounts. But the Russians had made one critical mistake. They were expanding into territories that were not theirs. Territories that for decades had belonged to another empire, the Italian Mafia. And in the world of organized crime, there is no such thing as peaceful coexistence. For generations, the Italian-American crime families, the Gambinos, the Colombos, the Luccheses, and others, ruled the streets of New York. They had the unions, the ports, the construction sites, and the political connections. They controlled everything from garbage collection to drug trafficking. But the Russians were different. They didn't ask permission, they didn't pay tribute, and they didn't play by the same rules. Their operations were quieter, cleaner, and harder to trace. While the Italians used loyalty and blood oaths, the Russians used intelligence and systems. To the Vory Zakon, respect wasn't earned through lineage, it was earned through strategy. It started, as most underworld conflicts do, with money. The Russian networks began undercutting Italian-controlled rackets in gasoline distribution, gambling, and loan sharking. The gasoline tax scam that Marat Balagula had perfected was generating millions, more than some mafia families made in a year. When the Italians realized the scale of what was happening, they were furious. John Gotti's Gambino family demanded a cut. The Russians refused. They weren't afraid. They had their own soldiers, many of them ex-Soviet military men with real combat experience. They didn't need the Italians' protection. They had their own. Tensions grew quietly at first. Meetings were held in dimly lit restaurants across Brooklyn, where interpreters tried to keep the peace between two criminal worlds that spoke different languages but understood the same concept: power. The Italians warned them, "You're moving too fast." The Russians answered coldly, "You're moving too slow." It was an insult that would soon be paid for in blood. The first sign of war came when one of Balagula's associates, a mid-level enforcer known only as Misha the Jeweler, was found dead in his car, shot twice in the head in a style that everyone recognized, a mafia message. The Russians, however, didn't respond with fear. They responded with precision. Within a week, an Italian collector from Bensonhurst was beaten nearly to death and dumped in the East River. The message was returned, and it was clear the Russians would not bow. For New York's underworld, this was unprecedented. The Italians had fought off challengers before, Irish gangs, Puerto Rican syndicates, even biker clubs, but the Russians were something new. They didn't care about the old codes. They had no boss of all bosses, no commission to negotiate with. Killing one Russian didn't stop anything. It just provoked chaos. Their structure was decentralized, fluid, and ruthless. They were ghosts that bled but never died. Law enforcement began to notice the pattern. FBI agents monitoring Italian wiretaps heard names that didn't sound familiar: Balagula, Rokotov, Baranov. The Italians spoke of them with a mix of anger and respect. One recorded conversation between two Colombo capos reportedly captured one saying, "These Russians don't scare. You cut one, another comes back stronger. They're like f***ing machines." It was the beginning of a new criminal order, one that would eventually outlive the very families that had ruled New York for half a century. The Russians' advantage wasn't just violence, it was psychology. They studied their enemies, learned their habits, their weaknesses, their networks. Many of them had served in Soviet intelligence or had connections to the KGB. They knew surveillance, they knew misdirection, and they knew how to make people disappear. When the Italians sent men to intimidate Russian business owners, those men often never returned. The NYPD began finding bodies in Staten Island marshes, in Queens warehouses, in abandoned Brooklyn docks, all killed with military precision, execution style, but without witnesses or evidence. At the same time, some of the smarter Italian bosses saw opportunity. They realized that fighting the Russians would be suicide. Instead, they tried to partner with them. The Colombos began working with Russian smugglers to move arms and heroin through Eastern Europe. The Gambinos, through intermediaries, collaborated on fuel distribution deals, turning their conflict into commerce. But others, especially the old-school soldiers, couldn't accept this new alliance. To them, the Russians were invaders, outsiders, unworthy of respect. And those men paid dearly for their pride. One of the most violent confrontations came in 1988. A crew of Italian enforcers attempted to hijack a shipment of fuel controlled by Balagula's people. The Russians responded immediately. That night, 3 of the hijackers were gunned down in a Brooklyn parking lot. Witnesses described it as a military-style operation. No arrests were made. The police said nothing. The Mafia said nothing. But in the streets, everyone understood. The Russians were now equals. Even within the FBI, agents began admitting something few wanted to say aloud, that the Italians were no longer the most powerful criminal force in New York. One internal report later described the Russian Mafia as a hybrid of organized crime and espionage, a network that used intelligence tactics to control money, politics, and violence without ever being seen. It was a machine built on discipline, loyalty, and paranoia, traits the Italians had lost over generations of greed and exposure. As the 1990s approached, a fragile truce took hold. The Italian families realized they could no longer dominate the criminal economy alone. The Russians, for their part, saw the value in cooperation. Joint ventures were formed, gambling operations, money laundering fronts, even real estate investments. On paper, these businesses looked legitimate. In reality, they were the beating heart of a new, transnational underworld that stretched from New York to Moscow, from Miami to Berlin. But the peace was uneasy. The Russians never forgot the early betrayals, and the Italians never forgot the humiliation of being challenged on their own soil. Every handshake carried the weight of suspicion. Every smile hid a knife. And though the open bloodshed subsided, the tension remained, a cold war of crime beneath the surface of New York City. In the end, the war with the Italians wasn't won with bullets, but with patience. The Russians understood that empires don't need to conquer through force, they conquer through survival. When the FBI later dismantled parts of the Italian Mafia in the 1990s, through massive racketeering trials and wiretap operations, the Russians watched quietly, learning, adapting and waiting. They had no central figure to betray, no hierarchy to collapse. While the Mafia fell, the Vory remained, invisible, decentralized, immortal. And so, in the streets once ruled by Gotti and the 5 families, another empire took root. Colder, smarter, and far more enduring. It was the dawn of a new age of organized crime, one where the old codes of honor gave way to something far more dangerous: a criminal network without a face, born from the ashes of the Soviet Union and baptized in the blood of New York. By the early 1990s, the streets of New York no longer belonged to the Italians alone. The Russian Mafia had risen from the immigrant underworld of Brighton Beach to become a global network, one that stretched from the collapsed Soviet states to the financial towers of Manhattan. Their operations were complex, their reach transnational, and their crimes almost impossible to trace. What began as smuggling and fuel fraud had evolved into something far darker: arms trafficking, nuclear material sales, cyber theft, and political corruption. For the FBI, this was no longer just organized crime. It was organized intelligence. At the center of this new frontier stood a name whispered across agencies and newspapers alike: Operation Odessa. It wasn't just a single mission. It was a decade-long attempt to untangle the web of Russian syndicates that had embedded themselves in the United States, Europe, and Latin America. What the Bureau discovered would forever change how America viewed organized crime and how it fought it. The operation's roots began in Miami, where agents had tracked an alarming pattern of financial transactions. Russian businessmen, many of whom had recently emigrated from Moscow, were buying luxury yachts, airplanes, and nightclubs with cash. Millions of dollars moved through offshore banks in Panama and Switzerland. At first, investigators assumed it was simple tax evasion or drug money laundering. But as they dug deeper, they realized these were not ordinary criminals. They were ex-KGB officers, arms dealers, and black market brokers who had fled the Soviet collapse with access to weapons, intelligence, and contacts across the globe. The Russian Mafia had become a hybrid, part criminal, part political, part military. In the chaos that followed the fall of the Iron Curtain, entire arsenals went missing: assault rifles, helicopters, even small submarines. Former Soviet generals sold their resources to whoever could pay: African warlords, Middle Eastern militias, or American-based Russian syndicates. And through this black market network flowed billions. The FBI feared what it might mean if nuclear materials were next. The first major break came when undercover agents in Miami posed as buyers for a Colombian cartel. Their goal was to trace a network rumored to be selling Soviet-made military helicopters. What they uncovered was stunning. The Russian mob was using front companies to broker arms deals between ex-Soviet officers, Colombian cartels, and Middle Eastern buyers. One negotiation involved not just helicopters, but also a working submarine to be delivered to South America for drug transport. The FBI could hardly believe it. This wasn't street-level crime. It was international trade in death. Operation Odessa officially launched in the mid-1990s. Its name was symbolic, a reference to both the legendary escape networks used by Nazi war criminals after World War II and the Russian port city, long known as a hub of smuggling. The FBI, DEA, and CIA collaborated for the first time on an operation that treated the Russian Mafia not as a domestic problem, but as a global threat. The agents knew they weren't chasing gangsters anymore. They were chasing businessmen who had learned to weaponize capitalism itself. One of the operation's key targets was a man known only as Tarzan, a former Soviet paratrooper turned nightclub owner in Miami. Charismatic, brutal, and cunning, Tarzan was the bridge between worlds, the man who introduced Russian arms dealers to Colombian traffickers. In a now famous sting operation, undercover agents posing as cartel representatives met Tarzan and his partners to negotiate the purchase of military helicopters. They agreed on the price, $35 million. What the Russians didn't know was that the entire deal was being recorded. The meeting ended in spectacular arrests, revealing a network that stretched from Moscow to Medellin. But the deeper the FBI went, the more they realized that Odessa was just one branch of a far greater tree. The Russian Mafia's influence extended into Europe's banking systems, Israel's diamond trade, and the United States technology sector. They had infiltrated Wall Street firms, used shell corporations to manipulate stock prices, and laundered billions through legitimate real estate. Every major city, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, London, Tel Aviv, had its own cell, all connected by a shared code and a shared silence. What made them almost impossible to dismantle was their adaptability. The Russians didn't fear prison. Most had already survived worse in the Soviet system. They didn't rely on hierarchy. If one leader was taken down, another immediately filled the void. And they didn't keep written records. Everything was stored in memory. Names, routes, bank codes. To the FBI, it was like fighting an enemy that could vanish at will. The Bureau shifted its tactics. Traditional surveillance wasn't enough. They needed linguists, financial analysts, and computer experts. They began tracking wire transfers, offshore accounts, and encrypted faxes sent from Brighton Beach to Moscow. It was the birth of a new kind of policing, one that combined criminal investigation with counterintelligence. Some agents described it as fighting ghosts with spreadsheets, but slowly patterns emerged. Through those patterns, arrests began. Still, every success came at a price. Informants disappeared, witnesses recanted, and evidence evaporated in bureaucratic smoke. The Russians played a longer game. They infiltrated legal systems, bribed lawyers, and funded politicians both in America and abroad. Their empire wasn't just about drugs or weapons, it was about influence. They had learned that in the West, power could be bought more easily with money than with bullets. By the late 1990s, the FBI had arrested several high-profile figures linked to the Russian Mafia, including remnants of Balagula's gasoline empire and successors who had turned to high-tech fraud. Yet despite those victories, the machine kept running. Every time a cell was broken, another appeared. In Miami, in Chicago, in Toronto, in Berlin, the Russians had built something that transcended borders and governments. They were no longer a criminal organization. They were a shadow economy. Operation Odessa revealed a chilling truth. Globalization had not just connected the world's markets, it had connected its criminals. The fall of the Soviet Union had unleashed thousands of former spies, soldiers, and scientists into a lawless new order, and many of them found their home under the banner of the Vory Zakon. The brotherhood that once ruled the gulags now ruled a transnational empire, its influence stretching into politics, finance, and warfare. For the FBI, it was both a triumph and a warning. They had glimpsed the future of organized crime, one that didn't need guns to kill or streets to rule. It operated in data, in contracts, in the very arteries of the global economy. And the Russians, born from the ashes of a fallen empire, had mastered it. Even today, the legacy of Operation Odessa endures. It proved that crime had evolved beyond borders, that the new wars would be fought not in alleys, but in boardrooms. The agents who led the case would later say that they hadn't stopped the Russians. They had only learned to recognize their reflection in the mirror of modern capitalism. The FBI's battle with the Russian Mafia was never about winning. It was about understanding, and in that understanding came a haunting realization. The Brotherhood didn't just survive the collapse of the Soviet Union, it had become its most successful export. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Russian Mafia had achieved what no other criminal organization in modern history had managed. It had become part of the system itself. What began in the frozen hell of Stalin's gulags had grown into a global empire of influence, money, and fear. Its soldiers no longer carried rifles in dark alleys. They carried briefcases, computers, and diplomatic passports. The Mafia's greatest trick was not in its violence, but in its transformation, from a gang of outlaws into an invisible hand that could manipulate economies, politics, and even governments without ever showing its face. The fall of the Soviet Union had created a vacuum, a nation rich in resources but poor in law. In that chaos, the Vory Visacone thrived. They were no longer the prisoners who defied the state. They were the new kings of it. With their connections to ex-KGB officers, military officials, and corrupt politicians, they became the architects of Russia's underground capitalism. Oil, gas, arms, and even human trafficking, nothing was beyond their reach. The mafia and the state began to merge in ways that made the line between crime and governance disappear. And from that fusion, a new form of power emerged, silent, global, and unstoppable. In America, their influence evolved with the times. The 1990s had seen brutal wars for territory and money, but the 2000s brought something more subtle: infiltration. The Russians shifted their attention to Wall Street, real estate, and cyberspace. They invested in properties across New York and Miami, turning stolen money into luxury skyscrapers and beachfront mansions. Their shell companies bought stocks, art, and even entire businesses. Every transaction looked legal, every signature legitimate, but behind the paperwork lay a legacy of blood and corruption. The FBI, having learned from Operation Odessa, adapted. Task forces specializing in financial crime and cyber fraud began to track Russian operations that spanned continents. Yet the deeper they dug, the more elusive the enemy became. The mafia's operations no longer relied on street-level crime, but on systems: hacking, banking, cryptocurrency. Some of their top operatives were no longer ex-prisoners or hitmen, but programmers, lawyers, and brokers. The Vory had evolved with terrifying intelligence. Their influence reached far beyond crime. In the 2000s and 2010s, oligarchs with ties to the Vory Visacone began purchasing newspapers, sports teams, and political influence. Some entered legitimate politics, others funded campaigns overseas. Through money, they gained respectability. Through fear, they maintained it. The old code of silence, omerta in the Italian world, molchania in the Russian, remained absolute. To speak was to die. To expose was to vanish. The Russian Mafia had also mastered the art of perception. They no longer needed to rule through public terror. They ruled through myth. Every community with a Russian population whispered stories of invisible power, of men who could make anyone disappear, of businessmen who answered to no one, of fortunes that came from nowhere. The truth didn't even matter anymore. The fear did. That fear became the mafia's new currency, more valuable than money, more lasting than violence. In global finance, their shadow grew. The Vory had learned that the 21st century's battlefield wasn't the street, it was the spreadsheet. They laundered billions through cryptocurrency, shell companies, and offshore trusts. They exploited Western laws designed to protect privacy and property. In places like London, Zurich, and New York, they built empires of legitimacy, hidden in plain sight. Banks welcomed their deposits, real estate agents sold them properties, and politicians looked the other way, as long as the money kept flowing. But every empire leaves traces, and the Russian Mafia's legacy was written in more than numbers. It was written in bodies, those who tried to resist, to expose, to reform. Journalists investigating Russian crime syndicates in Moscow or abroad often found themselves threatened, exiled, or worse. Some disappeared entirely. In 2006, the assassination of journalist Anna Politkovskaya in Moscow and the poisoning of ex-FSB agent Alexander Litvinenko in London showed the world how blurred the line had become between criminal retribution and political execution. The message was unmistakable. The code of the Vory was still alive: silence, loyalty, and death. The Russian Mafia's reach became so vast that intelligence agencies began treating it as a parallel power structure, one that influenced global politics as much as global crime. Europol once described it as a hydra with financial arms in every major economy, and yet no one could destroy it. Arrests were made, assets seized, but the core survived. It adapted faster than any government agency could respond. Every new technology, from online banking to cryptocurrency, became another tool in its arsenal. Culturally, the legend of the Russian Mafia became part of the Western imagination. Movies, TV shows, and novels portrayed them as cold, ruthless, almost superhuman, men with icy eyes and unbreakable codes. But the truth was more complex. They were not monsters from fiction. They were survivors of a system that had bred them. Men who learned that morality was a luxury and survival was the only virtue. The world they created was not born from evil alone, but from the chaos of history itself, from oppression, hunger, and the collapse of order. As the decades passed, a chilling paradox emerged. While other organized crime groups crumbled under law enforcement pressure, the Russian Mafia only became more refined, more global, and more intelligent. They no longer needed guns to control cities. They had influence over governments, corporations, and media. They didn't fight wars anymore. They financed them. They didn't fear exposure. They owned it. The line between the state and the syndicate had blurred beyond recognition. Today, when investigators talk about the Russian Mafia, they rarely speak of gangsters in leather jackets. They speak of oligarchs, bankers, and power brokers. They speak of silent deals made behind closed doors, of elections influenced through hidden money, of digital wars waged in the name of profit and revenge. The Mafia no longer needed to conquer territory. It conquered systems. Yet beneath all the sophistication, the same heartbeat remains, the same code born in the gulags. Never betray, never speak, never forget. The faces may have changed, but the essence endures. The Vory Zakone are still out there, not as an army, but as a legacy, one that moves silently through nations, disguised as progress. The Russian Mafia's true power lies not in its brutality, but in its permanence. It has survived dictatorships, revolutions, and capitalism itself. It has become a mirror of the modern world, efficient, ruthless, and without a conscience. Its story is not just one of crime, but of evolution. It's the story of how darkness learned to wear a suit and shake hands with the light. And so, the legacy continues, unseen but everywhere. The fear remains, the silence remains, and the question echoes still. When a criminal empire becomes indistinguishable from the system it inhabits, is it still the underworld? Or has it become the world itself?